Hola amigos, bienvenidos de nuevo a otro episodio de Generación Tech. Me llamo Alonso. The Star Wars galaxy is no stranger to conflict, and so if there's one thing I'm certain of, is that at any given moment in galactic history, on some grassy plain, or over some planet, on an asteroid belt, or just on some rocky moon, there is going to be conflict. Anything ranging from a small skirmish to a full-on intergalactic war. With so many different sentient species, at different levels of technology, with different belief systems and culture and culinary tastes, you're bound to have some of the strangest and weirdest looking armies, using the most bizarre weapons and tools to bash each other's heads in. There is a terrifying and innovative creativity that drives the design of weapons of war in the Star Wars galaxy. And because the lore in Star Wars is so rich, it's oftentimes very easy for us to draw comparisons between things in universe to things in our own world. We do it often on this channel, if you're a regular viewer. The tie-in space superiority starfighter with its light armor, fuel efficiency, and maneuverability is a great analog for the Mitsubishi A6M0. And the stoic Imperial Navy pilot is an even better analog for the Imperial Japanese Navy pilots. The T-65B X-Wing, on the other hand, if we're keeping with the War in the Pacific theme, is the Grumman F4F Wildcat. Less agile of a fighter, but with a stronger and more rugged airframe. I mean, even their armament kind of lines up. You know, the TIE Fighter has heavier weapons, the Zero has 20mm cannons, the X-Wing has 4 slightly less powerful laser cannons, and then the Wildcat has, like 650 cals? We've also talked about the Separatist supership, the Malevolence, which met a fate quite similar to the real-life German battleship, the Bismarck. Then you have the LAAT gunship, which is almost a perfect analog for the Mi-24 Hind. No one else makes such an aggressive combination of a gunship and a transport. And if you think about it, the clone troopers have always been kind of Soviet in their tactics, especially in the earlier years of the conflict. They loved to use meat wave attacks, especially at Geonosis. But you know what kind of weapons we rarely ever see in the Star Wars galaxy? It's the heavy bomber, or the strategic bomber. Now, a heavy bomber is a large vehicle that usually has a massive payload, which allows you to drop munitions that can destroy a pretty significant amount of enemy assets or vehicles on the ground. Something like the B-17 Flying Fortress, which was crucial in destroying the industrial capabilities of Nazi Germany during World War II. Or better yet, the British Lancaster, which was featured in the film Dam Busters, which heavily inspired the Battle of Yavin. If you've seen Dam Busters, you'll know that George Lucas basically ripped off some of the dialogue and also the cinematography. I mean, he borrowed from a lot of different sources and mashed it together, but that is the influence. That is the movie that influenced the Trench Run, specifically. Now, strategic bombers are pretty similar to heavy bombers, except they have a payload usually large enough to do damage to even bigger areas, industrial parks, entire cities, entire armies, and they have a strategic value when they're used. Think the even larger B-29 Superfortress, which were used to drop the atomic bombs over Japan, or something even like the B-2 Spirit, which uses stealth technology to avoid enemy defenses and deliver payloads deep behind enemy lines. While heavy bombers have grown less important in the modern era due to advancements of ground-to-air defense systems and also air-to-air missiles, modern strategic bombers need to be able to penetrate enemy defenses, thus the stealth capabilities. Although with the invention of all types of long-range and oftentimes very precise munitions, one could argue even the strategic bombers' days are limited. Now, in the Star Wars universe, if you actually take a look at the battles, the tactics, the technology being used does seem a bit dated. It's definitely not as advanced as modern warfare here on Earth. For instance, while most battles in space do occur at massive distances according to our own standards, they still happen within line of sight, which means it's kind of close range if you consider how big space is. We see plenty of dogfights at extremely close ranges, even though there are guided munitions like concussion missiles and proton torpedoes and countermeasures to deter them. Most kills in space seem to be done with the basic laser cannon. It's not all that different from World War II era dogfights, except in space. And it is said that when George Lucas, created a lot of these dogfights, he was inspired by gun cams from World War II fighter pilots. I have to say that in the video games like Jedi Squadrons, you are using missiles far more, locking on and stuff. And so those battles are kind of like, equivalent to the 60s, to the, 70s, 80s in our own timeline as far as how aerial combat takes place. So if we're at the level of World War II technology in a lot of these battles, there should be heavy bombers as well, yet the only heavy bomber I can really think about without going into the deep lore is this thing, the MZ-100 Star Fortress SF-17 heavy bomber. from your boys at Slane and Corporal. They do the B-19 Starfighter as well. They really love vertically configured starships. And right away from its name, you can tell that the creators of this large bomber are trying to pay homage to the original B-17 Flying Fortress, which is probably one of the most iconic and famous heavy bombers of World War II. I think there were more B-25s manufactured, but the B-17s dropped more bombs, for sure. Probably dropped a few too many bombs. Destroyed too many cities. Although I have to say, if you look at the Star Fortress's cockpit, it looks a lot more like a B-29's. Actually, a lot of starships, including the Millennium Falcon, copied the B-29 cockpit. And that's because the B-29 cockpit had to be pressurized, and so it was stepless, as in it doesn't create any breaks in the contour of the nose to allow for maximum strength and also aerodynamics. The B-29 was a high-altitude bomber. And so it kind of makes sense that Star Wars starships would copy the B-29's cockpit design. I like that. Anyway, the Star Fortress is a strange-looking vehicle, but it definitely is a heavy bomber in its configuration. It's slow, big, has several gunner positions and ball turrets to deter enemy fighters from attacking it. They also tend to fly in formation so that you have overlapping fields of fire, along with a fighter escort guiding them. Even the proton bombs inside of the starships are held in a magazine and seem to use gravity to be dropped, but actually are magnetically propelled. By the way, this thing holds up to 1,048 bombs, which is a pretty robust payload, guys. Although the proton bomblets are quite small compared to other munitions we've seen, I imagine they each only weigh around maybe 100 to 150 pounds, which would give the Star Fortress a payload of around 100,000 to 150,000 pounds, which isn't that crazy, actually. The B-52 Stratofortress, for instance, had a payload of 75,000 pounds, although it usually carried that in 84 500-pound bombs. Great way to make a giant parking lot. Yeah, we're kind of a crazy country. So anyway, from a heavy bomber perspective, a lot of things check out for this design. But these Star Fortresses get absolutely murked on their way to blowing up this massive 8-kilometer-long First Order Manticore 4 class siege dreadnought. For all you Americans out there, 8 kilometers is about 2 laps around Talladega. And then there's the whole situation with the magnetic bombs dropping. It just seems kind of silly, right? In the Star Wars galaxy where you have, like, again, proton torpedoes, when you have lasers, why would you design a weapon that forces you to get this close to your enemy before dropping the munitions? It seems silly, it seems contrived. It's almost as if they're trying to mimic how World War II bombers work. But then I dug deeper into the lore, and we found out that the Star Fortress is not really a tested combat vehicle at all. It was originally contracted by the New Republic in the last days of the Galactic Civil War. Slane and Corporal, again, they're the ones who were behind this design. They've never designed a heavy bomber, and it kind of shows, I think, with how they configured this thing. The biggest thing they built so far was like the B-Wing. And I'm guessing what happened was the New Republic had a very specific need on the battlefield. They were looking for something like a heavy bomber to tackle the ridiculous amounts of Star Destroyers the Imperial Remnant still had in their arsenal. So the New Republic faced a very specific dilemma. The Empire was not a normal faction. Throughout galactic history, you had very militarized groups like the Mandalorians, even the Sith Empire, but what made Emperor Palpatine's Galactic Empire so different was just the sheer size of his ships. The ISD was 1.6 kilometers long. He had Super Star Destroyers that were up to 19 kilometers long. This is just much larger than your typical type of capital ship, and so the New Republic needed some type of bomber that could concentrate a crazy amount of firepower in a relatively small space, and this starship also had to be relatively cheap and easy to produce. And this is where we get this very unbalanced vessel, the Star Fortress. It's super niche, but again, this is what the New Republic needed. Because remember, guys, the Rebel Alliance always lacked powerful capital ships with enough firepower, and so they always tried to supplement their fleet's firepower with assault bombers like the Y-Wing, but that wasn't good enough, so then we see the creation of the B-Wing, also from Slane and Corporal, but that wasn't exactly the most reliable or easy to pilot ship either. Like a squadron of Y-Wings and B-Wings could technically disable a Star Destroyer, especially if you're using ion torpedoes, but they needed something that could knock out an ISD in just one blow, because sometimes one salvo from an ISD could destroy a Mon Calamari cruiser with its shields down. I mean, these were very dangerous things they were going up against. We also have to remember, those remaining Super Star Destroyers are going to pose a huge threat for the New Republic. They simply did not have anything that could handle something of that size. Hence the 1,048 bomb payload. And remember, these are proton bombs, not normal, like 500-pound bombs. This is something at a completely different level when it comes to just the potency. If you take a look at the New Republic's Pyrrhic victory at Jakku, the captain of a Starhawk-class battleship actually had to lock on their tractor beam to an Executor-class Super Star Destroyer and drag it down onto the planets, where both ships were essentially destroyed. Even though this exchange favored the New Republic, it was a huge waste of resources. If they could instead just send a wing of these bombers, you're going to be saving a lot more resources, a lot more lives, so it does kind of make sense. I understand what they're trying to do with this. So when does the Star Fortress first see combat? Well, Mon Mothma started demilitarizing the Republic immediately after the defeat of the last major Imperial fleet at Jakku. And so the Star Fortresses that were built were eventually scrapped and sold to scrapyards, or some were decommissioned and used for civilian purposes. For instance, some mining companies found these platforms pretty useful. They could use the proton bombs on board to crack open asteroids or dig new pit mines. You actually could program how the bombs fell, so you could create like kind of a pattern if you're trying to dig a certain shaped hole or something like that, which is kind of nice. Also, another civilian use was these bombers were converted into firefighting vessels. So you replace the bomb bay with like a large water tank. Eventually, the Resistance bought a bunch of these old fortresses from these mining corporations and refitted them for warfare. Now, even though the fortress was going up against a more modern First Order Navy during the evacuation of Dakar, I think had this heavy bomber gone up against the Galactic Empire in those late stages of the war, it still would have suffered really heavy casualties, especially if it wasn't deployed properly or in contested space. There's only one scenario where this bomber actually makes sense, and you have to give Poe Dameron credit for seeing that opportunity. Even though he disobeys the orders of Jedi General Princess Senator Leia, that siege dreadnought was about to do some major damage with those autocannons. Just one shot with this thing to a Mon Calamari cruiser and it's probably toast, along with all of your hero units. And with the Resistance forces still evacuating personnel from the planet below, and with much of your fleet already deployed, there's really no way that your capital ship can just jump into hyperspace. You're not the Empire after all. You gotta watch out for your people. And so Poe Dameron had to destroy that dreadnought before it destroyed his home fleet. But there's really nothing the Resistance arsenal can use to pierce the shields of even a Resurgent-class Star Destroyer, let alone that siege dreadnought, which is where the Star Fortress comes into place. As terribly designed as this ship was, its purpose is really not all that different from the Orc at Helm's Deep, with the torch. It's got one job, a one-way journey type of job. Those 1,048 proton bombs give you far more damage in a concentrated area than anything else the Resistance had. Even if the entire fleet aimed all of their turbolasers at one spot on an enemy ship, I don't think you're going to get the same firepower as 1,000 proton bombs. Also, notice when the bombs go flying down, they don't trigger any shields. That or they just destroy them immediately. It could be that the lack of propulsion on these bombs made them slow enough to pass through the deflector shields. But yeah, this was the one scenario where it made sense for you to sacrifice these bombers. It was actually a very desperate move, but it was probably the right move. This was the only chance the Resistance had to survive this encounter and give the rest of the fleet a chance to escape into hyperspace. I think in most normal situations, a heavy bomber like this is just a liability. It'll get shut down very quickly. They're also going to be very vulnerable to enemy fighters for sure. But also they're slow enough to actually get shot down by enemy turbo lasers as well. I think the First Order avoided using their turbo lasers on the Resistance in this scene, most likely avoid friendly fire. Unlike the Empire, these fascists actually cared about their TIE fighter pilots. But I think if the TIE fighter pilots had held back and refused to engage those bombers, for the First Order fleet could have just picked off all of those Star Fortresses with its big guns. I mean, they're not moving quick enough to do evasive action. This is why in Star Wars, there's really just only two types of ships. Starfighters that are nimble enough to avoid larger and more powerful emplacements, and then larger ships that are robust enough to have shields that are good enough that they can take a direct blow. And when I mean large enough, I mean a lot bigger than the Star Fortress. I'm talking about at least 100 or 200 meters. Kind of like the CR-90 Corvette. It could at least take a couple shots from the ISD's turbo lasers before its shields were completely gone. That usually gave it enough time to escape into hyperspace. The Star Fortress was neither. It didn't have powerful shields, and it also wasn't fast. It was kind of a sitting duck. This is why most factions at best have something more nimble like the Y-Wing, or the Separatists with their Hyena bomber, or the Empire which had the TIE bomber. Even in Legends where you do have some more medium and heavy bombers, these starships are going to be far more maneuverable than what the Star Fortress was. If you notice, there's only usually the Rebels who use these heavier bombers. We have the Incom PTB-625 planetary bomber, and the Cohen-Sarah BTL-S8 K-Wing. It seems like only factions that are going up against enemies with massive capital ships will resort to these kinds of heavy bomber platforms. And if you take a look at the Galactic Empire, all those missions where a heavy bomber might come in handy, well, you can give those missions to an ISD and its turbo laser. The Empire is famous for providing orbital barrages for their infantry formations with the ISD. Imperial combined arms tactics extended very vertically into orbit, and those same turbolasers could easily take out an MC-80 cruiser. I think the Empire, because of their heavy firepower based on energy weapons, never needed a heavy bomber in the same way that the Rebellion did. I mean, the only time we see the Empire carpet bomb anything is that one time Han Solo was hiding in the asteroid field after the Battle of Hoth, and also on the Knights of 1,000 Tears. The Empire could have used orbital bombardments, but I feel like this was a bit more personal for them, so they used fusion bombs, which, were deployed from TIE bombers. I guess they wanted to make the surface radioactive so, the Mandalorians don't come back somehow. They're pretty tough to get rid of. So there you have it, guys. That is my analysis of the heavy bomber and why we don't see many of them in the Star Wars galaxy. Some technologies just don't make sense in universe, and I think that's one of them. Let me know in the comment section below what you guys think, and also don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. See you next time.